Well, folks, we have plowed through this book and we are at the very last chapter at the end of the book, and I think it's a very nice book, very concisely written. You can read it in 1 weekend, lots of good concepts, and as we will learn in this chapter, this is not some theory that we are looking at. This is not some hypothesis to be tested. These are practical issues that were learned by observing the systems and how they work. You know, the action arena was the key concept that Elinor Ostrom developed and then went on to saying what are the design principles that could be applied in many different action arenas. You know, in science in general, we may have some data and then data points to something, so you build a hypothesis based on what conclusion you can draw from data analysis. Then you try to get more data to test the hypothesis, and if the hypothesis tests positively, then you make a theory out of it. Then people keep on using the theory and finding more data that proves the theory, or at least is consistent with the theory. And anytime you find data that doesn't agree with the theory, then you have to go back and see whether there are exceptions or whether your theory is wrong, and so on and so forth. In social sciences, this is not exactly the way it'll work, and yet here it has taken that shape in terms of somebody spending so much time in the field in different systems to learn how actually commons are dealt with by people, by participants in different action arenas, and how rules, norms and punishments play a role. So look at another example here about how the rules actually may have unintended consequences sometimes. Okay, so the nice good example. So the key concepts in this chapter, we will learn see a summary of the lessons learned from this book. So we will see a summary of the lessons learned from the book, learn why we still cannot solve all collective action problems, and we are learning this particular course in the context of sustainability, in the context of climate change. So this is the biggest collective action problem we are facing, an evolutionary time scale problem in fact, and the battle is on to see whether we will get ahead of this problem and make the world sustainable and protect lives, be equitable, be just, and so on, and of course solve the carbon problem and the global warming problem along the way, right? Get exposed to the big challenges we are still facing in the governance of in governing the commons. So we will look at few big challenges that are daunting, but there are some good optimistic examples that say maybe we can lick this problem, maybe we can in fact solve this problem. And larger the scale, more complicated it is, and more the people, more the opportunity for free riding. Many people are good at taking the opportunity to shirk their duties, responsibilities and their contributions to the collective action. But then do you really need 100% of the participants to be fully engaged to solve a problem of collective action? I would say if you have enough problem, majority of the people are doing the right thing and carrying out their duties and responsibilities, then we can solve the problem, because the problem of free riders never really goes away, right? So in that context, what have we learned? This book has provided an introduction to the study of institutions and governance in general, and of governance of the commons in particular. And atmosphere is a common, ocean is a common, land is a common, and what we do in one place affects everything. So we are dealing with the classical quintessential commons problem when it comes to climate change. But there are issues, because climate change, at least for now, is still creating winners and losers, so not everybody is really keen on solving the problem. So that is one of the big challenges ahead as well. Common pool resources often face the challenge of over harvesting, while public goods face the problems of under provision. So the Hardin's example, was it Hadrin or Hardin? John Hardin, right? Yeah. Tragedy of the Commons. I don't know how I could forget this. I've done this 1,000 times, but sometimes suddenly you become clueless or blank out. So it's John Hardin. No, that's not what we want. There was an outlaw. John Wesley Hardin was an American Old West outlaw, gunfighter, and controversial folk icon. That's not what we are talking about. Hardin comes up. So let's see. Tragedy of the Commons. I'm doing this live because you can see how teaching can be Hardin. Yes, it is Hardin, except it's not John. I was searching the wrong name. We talked about this already many times. The Tragedy of the Commons. Let's see. What's Garrett Hardin? There we go. Garrett Hardin, the example of the Tragedy of the Commons, and we talked about how it was a misnomer because he was really talking about common pool resource like a pasture that people were trying to exploit, and there was no restriction on how many sheep each person could have, so everybody keeps buying more and more sheep, and soon you have too many sheep and too little pasture to graze on. So that's open source common pool resource, whereas public goods are where some common investment is involved, governance is involved, and investment is done to provide public services. Could be roads, bridges, dams, networks for communication, and so on. And typically public goods face the problem of under provision. Despite the difficult challenges associated with governing these types of goods, we see successful performance of many common pool resource systems and successful provision of public goods. We need to extend the lessons learned from these successes to better understand the general properties of different approaches to successfully governing the commons. So this is obviously learning by doing. So climate change, we looked at polycentric governance and how many rules, regulations, nationally determined contributions, etc. have evolved. We have gone from top-down Kyoto Protocol to a democratic bottom-up nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, but obviously emissions are still not coming down, so we have to keep going with this learning by doing. Eleanor Ostrom developed a coherent theoretical framework that enables scholars to clearly articulate how institutional arrangements can facilitate successful governance of the commons. So this was the biggest contribution she made and won the Nobel Prize for it, that men, humans in general are not rational egoists. They're not always trying to maximize selfish interest, but there are ways to govern the commons, and it's also a scale issue, as we will see again, that we already talked in the last chapter. By institutions, we refer to the prescriptions that humans use to organize all forms of repetitive and structured interactions. So whether it's a marketplace, whether it's an airline, whether it's an office, whether it's a government, whether it's just a neighborhood, there is always an action arena where repetitive and structured interactions are happening, and there are rules and norms and punishments which we call prescriptions. So the prescriptions are rules and norms. They apply not only to common pool resources such as groundwater, but also to other type of social dilemma situations like traffic, Wikipedia, sports, and healthcare. I mentioned wicked problems before, which is not addressed here, because there are problems like healthcare which are called wicked problems, where there is never really a solution, so you keep resolving the issue, and which means you have to resolve it again and again over time. A key concept in studying institutions is the action arena. An action arena consists of people as participants and an action situation in which they participate. So it could be Wikipedia, it could be healthcare, it could be sports. When people interact in an action situation, they make decisions based on the choice rules associated with the position they occupy in the action situation. Could be student, teacher, governance in the university, or spectator, referee and player in a sports situation. In a given action situation, people may hold different positions and therefore may not be able to make the same decisions or have the same information. So a player is following different set of rules compared to spectators versus security versus the referee and so on. The interactions of the participants lead to outcomes that can be evaluated. The spectator is there to go and enjoy the game, root for their favorite team and celebrate the win or be sad about the loss and so on and so forth. Players are of course playing to win, but also to make sure that they get a better contract based on how well they play and so on and so what kind of leadership they show in that action situation and so on. Figure 15.1 we'll look at, which we have looked at as 2.5 before in terms of IAD analysis, shows the schematic representation of the institutional analysis and development framework and highlights the key components necessary for studying how institutions structure action situations. The IAD framework emphasizes the fact that action situations are influenced by broader contextual variables. So there are exogenous variables that are always playing on top of the action situation and the expected outcome with all its rules and positions and so on. The biophysical conditions, whether you live in a desert or a rainforest, affect the rules and norms concerning how to build houses and how to organize healthcare. For example, due to different diseases that are prevalent in a given area, tropics versus mid-latitudes versus deserts and rainy regions. The attributes of a community, such as the age and income distribution, education and kin relationships, affect which kind of interactions one can expect in action situations. Okay, so we will conclude this podcast with this one. It may be getting a bit long, but let's look at this figure again quickly, which we have looked at. So we have exogenous variables which act on the action arena. So biophysical conditions decide that, desert versus rainforests, attributes of the community. So whether you are agricultural community or professionals, technologists and so on, and the rules in use for living in that situation, taxes you pay, houses you can build, zoning laws, everything. Participants then are in the action situations and they interact with each other repetitively and under structured conditions that are expected to bring an outcome. Could be just coexisting in that situation, making your livelihoods and making your election votes, everything, your commerce and so on. And there are evaluative criteria. Are you playing fair? Are you paying taxes? Are you cheating? And so on, which determine the outcome, which then feed back to the action situation and the action arena. Okay, so we'll come back and look at this again for a second and continue with the additional points. So these are just kind of summary of things we have already done, but now we'll put it in the context of why we are not really so good at solving common actions problems, collective action problems like the climate change problem, and whether we are headed in the direction of solving it as we keep going forward with adaptation and mitigation, which we discussed a little bit before. Okay, so we'll come back and do that in the next podcast.